Well, regardless of your thoughts, that was a hilarious notification for any Browns fan to read. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, then please do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. So, the Cincinnati Bengals, obviously after losing Joe Burrow for the season, if there's any chance of him coming back, it would be, later in the playoffs. They decided to roll with Jake Browning. Some of my friends, NFL friends, were telling me, Jake Browning is one of the best backups in the league. Maybe you could lead him to the playoffs. I had a good deal at that. All it took was 3 games for them to have enough of Jake Browning. 0-3 in those 3 games. 6 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. Obviously was not looking great. They have the worst offense in the league statistically with Jake Browning. So they've obviously decided to make the change, go and get a quarterback that a lot of people thought that they would do. Would it be Russell Wilson, Jameis Winston, 2 of those quarterbacks over at the Giants now that they've made the switch to Dart? That might have been the most logical sense for most people. But instead, they've decided to trade for Cleveland Browns' own Joe Flacco. So, going to talk about the trade, give my quick thoughts on it, and obviously what that means for Flacco to the Bengals, what that means for Dylan Gabriel here at the Browns, and obviously what that means for Shedeur Sanders as well as the likely now backup for the Cleveland Browns. So where do we start? First and foremost, I am quite impressed that the Cleveland Browns were able to get a 5th round pick for a 40-year-old Joe Flacco. I don't even think the Browns probably thought they were going to get a 5th round pick for Joe Flacco. A lot of people are going to say, now that they've traded Flacco after week 5, what was the whole point of him starting? And, while I agree with some sentiment of that in terms of, I was someone that was quite vocally did not want Joe Flacco to be the starter. I wanted it to be Kenny Pickett because I wanted them to at least have one of those guys as the bridge. And, for me, that was Kenny Pickett. But to say what was the point for any of those two is what I disagree with. Just, I didn't want to start week 1 with a rookie, especially with the kind of gauntlet of a schedule that the Browns had. So it's not the fact that it's, they've started a veteran for 5 weeks that annoys me. It just annoyed me that it was Joe Flacco in the first place, shall we say. Joe Flacco obviously did not play well for the Cleveland Browns. He was benched for a rookie, Dylan Gabriel, earlier than some people maybe thought that he would have been. So that obviously didn't work out here. And somehow they got a 5th round pick for that. So quite impressive bit of work there to get a 5th round pick. They gave up a 6th and Joe Flacco to get a 5th round pick from the Bengals. I think that's 3 5th round picks they now have in the next draft. 3 5th round picks you can use as ammo with some of those earlier picks if you want to move up at any point. Getting a 5th round pick is good business for a 40-year-old Joe Flacco who might retire at the end of the season. So happy for Joe because he gets to go and play starting football. As I said, he might retire at the end of the year, so at least he gets to spend his final season playing and throwing the ball downfield to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. That will at least be fun for him, regardless of what the Bengals record ends up being. So happy for him to do that rather than obviously sit behind a rookie with a clipboard. But I can eat my words on this, and I probably end up being wrong because it always is the case with the Browns. So he probably will end up going over there and somehow leading them to the playoffs. But as I mentioned at the start, I think there's better options were out there. Jameis Winston would have made a lot more sense than trading a 5th round pick for a 40-year-old. But they've obviously decided that that's the move they wanted to do. Joe Flacco goes to the Bengals. Let's see how it works out. He's going to probably throw for a lot of yards, probably going to throw a lot of interceptions as well. But, I'm sure Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are happy purely from a statistical standpoint. To go and get Joe Flacco throwing them the ball. They'd prefer that to Jake Browning. But, what's he going to look like behind, what is at this point the worst ranked offense in the NFL. They're 32nd in yards, dead last in yards, dead last in turnovers, 29th in points allowed, 31st in first down. So a pretty bad offense, and that's even including the couple games to start the season with Joe Burrow. Jake Browning was sacked 9 times in his 3 starts. The Browns' offensive line was a mess, and we saw what that looked like with Joe Flacco. The Cincinnati Bengals' offensive line is also a mess, so you would expect it to look fairly similar. But we'll see how it works out. See how Zach Taylor, see if he's any better at getting anything out of Joe Flacco behind a bad O-line, and see how that obviously works for the Bengals. But if I'm a Bengals fan, I wouldn't be betting on Joe Flacco to do what he did with the Browns in 2023 and go and lead them to the playoffs. But the AFC is somewhat wide open. The teams that have jumped ahead are teams that a lot of people maybe, not maybe, but definitely didn't expect to be in that position after the first 5 weeks of the season. Do they stay in that position? If not, as I said, they start losing games. The conference could be wide open. There could be a team or two that get in with a 9-8 record or a 10-7 record. So that's obviously what they're banking on with this move, and we'll see how it works out for them. But good for Joe to go and get, maybe finish his career starting some games to end it. So what does that mean for Dylan? Well, the Browns are obviously confident enough in Dylan, what they saw from Dylan on Sunday in London, to make this move. Maybe not. Maybe they just were like, well, 5th round pick for Joe Flacco, fuck it, we can't turn that down. But I do think, even with that being said, as I said, I don't think they thought they could get a 5th round pick. But even with that being said, they're not going to make this trade. They're not going to start making those calls and start, constructing this trade if they didn't believe in Dylan, and weren't obviously, happy with what they saw from Dylan on Sunday. Happy enough to go, well, yeah, we're happy in the decision that we've made to switch to Dylan, and we want to stick with that and going forward. And obviously, so it's a good thing for Dylan. Shows you that the team are, happy with him, confident in him. On the flip side of it, you could say, like, yes, he hasn't got a Joe Flacco behind him. It might have been easier, shall we say, for Kevin Stefanski, if Dylan was getting lit up in a game, to put Joe Flacco in there as the veteran, maybe as that calming presence. So you could say it on that side, but then also on the other side, of course, now with Shedeur likely being the number 2, there is, of course, going to be calls every time that Dylan misses a throw, any bad play that Dylan makes now. There's going to be a large, subsection on social media calling for Shedeur Sanders to be brought in, ahead of Dylan, ahead of him. So whatever way you want to look at it, you could say it was a good thing, you could say it's a bad thing, but at the end of the day, it shows that the team are confident in Dylan. So, I was impressed with what I saw from Dylan. If you go watch my review of that game, gave my thoughts on Dylan, I was impressed with what I saw. I think he made a couple of nice throws. Yes, a couple of rookie errors, shall we say, as to be expected for a rookie making their first start. Making their first start in a different country, first time ever leaving the USA, going up against a Brian Flores defense. So, but even with that being said, I was impressed with what we saw from Dylan. So the Browns are clearly confident in him. Obviously, let's see what we can, let's see what more we get from Dylan in the coming weeks, starting this week in Pittsburgh. But then obviously, with Shedeur Sanders, he will now likely become the number 2. I did make a joke and tweet out that Browns Twitter is going to a meltdown when Bailey Zappi is elevated from the practice squad and announced as the quarterback 2. That, of course, was tongue-in-cheek. I do expect Shedeur to be the number 2, and that to be announced as him as the number 2. I'm sure the next time that we hear Kevin speak, that will probably be the first question he gets asked: is Shedeur Sanders the number 2? And I expect him to say yes. Look, at the end of the day, going into this season, when you've got Joe Flacco, Kenny Pickett, and 2 rookies on your roster, the expectation was that these 2 rookies, at least one of them was going to get a shot throughout the season. In a year that a lot of us knew wasn't a year that they were competing, shall we say, for a Super Bowl. This was more of a transition year. All the talk about rebuilds, this is the first true year, first year of a rebuild under this regime. And to obviously go into that year with 2 rookie quarterbacks, you wanted to see what you had in those guys, especially 2 mid to late round rookie quarterbacks. with the team having 2 first-round picks going into next year in a draft that, a lot of people want to talk about the quarterbacks in. So, they basically got a year to show what they have. We wanted to see them probably as early as we possibly could. And now we get the chance to do so. We've been 5 games. The Browns are 1-4. It of course sucks, and we can talk about that in another video and going forward. But now after 5 games, we've got 12 games with Dylan Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders. As Dylan Gabriel is the starter. I'm rooting for Dylan Gabriel. How do I word this? I don't want to see Shedeur, because then that means that Dylan Gabriel is bad. Do you know what I mean? I want whoever the guy is in there to do well, and obviously the guy in there right now is Dylan Gabriel. I want Dylan Gabriel to do well, and I'm obviously rooting for him. He will get as many games as he's allowed, and obviously see. I said when the Browns made the move that he'll probably get, in my opinion, 6 to 8 games, as bad as it gets. I still think that's the case, even with Shedeur now right behind him as the number 2. But overall, as I said, we get to see what we have in these 2 rookies. If Dylan doesn't work out, then Shedeur comes in. Then obviously we get to see what we have in Shedeur as well. So this is a good move overall, I think. As I said, I didn't want Flacco to begin with, but I understood, why they did it. They obviously felt like he gave them the best chance to win some games over this stretch. That wasn't the case. They weren't able to do that, so they made the move to Dylan. Why not then make the move to trade Flacco and have Shedeur Sanders as the backup? Doesn't really make much sense having Joe in there as the backup. So happy for everyone involved. I'm sure all the Browns quarterbacks are happy to some extent. Joe Flacco gets to go and start, as I mentioned. Shedeur Sanders gets promoted essentially to the backup. He's going to be happy about that. I'm sure most Browns fans are happy that they definitely won't have to see Joe Flacco again this year. But it does also bring up one question that I'm sure a lot of people are talking about, and I've already seen a lot about on social media, and that is the quarterback 3. Because, I mentioned earlier Bailey Zappi. I expect over the coming few weeks, whether they elevate him to the active roster, or if they just promote him, on game day from the practice squad the next 2 weeks. Of course, you get 3 elevations in a year. So if they do that, once or twice, maybe 3 times over the next couple of weeks, and he's obviously the emergency QB. But then obviously, we've heard a lot about the other quarterback, the thou shall not be named quarterback, shall we say, that some people want to argue that is waiting in the wing behind these other guys, and that is of course Deshaun Watson, who he's been posting the training hype videos the last couple of months. We're hearing reports about him being close to being able to practice and this kind of stuff. I think that's, as I said, a lot of people are probably happy that these rookies are now getting their chance and that they won't have to see Joe Flacco again. But I do also think a lot of people in the back of their minds are going, please no, please no, please do not mean that this, don't mean that this means that Deshaun Watson is going to come back into the fold. And, even if it's as a backup, because you go into a game this year with a rookie quarterback and Deshaun Watson is your backup. The back of your mind, you are worried that something happens to that rookie and Deshaun Watson ends up going into the game. Don't get me wrong. It would probably be the most Browns thing ever for Deshaun Watson to somehow end up coming into a game or multiple games or whatever and somehow playing well, even though everything we've seen from him would suggest otherwise. Just the shitstorm that would cause on social media. There is it's a small amount, but there are a few people left that are clinging on to Deshaun Watson, being able to be a good quarterback still in the NFL. I just think that would be the most hilarious thing, the most Browns thing ever for all of this situation and this season with the quarterbacks, and somehow Deshaun Watson gets in there and is actually good. And then people are going to be going, well, let's stick with Deshaun Watson. Well, I think a lot of people, myself included, no matter how good he would have looked, would be like, no, we're not doing this again. So that is, of course, something that some people are going to be worried about. What does this mean for Deshaun Watson? For the next 3 weeks at least, I don't think it means anything. He's not even returned to practice yet in any capacity, so you're not going to just somehow sprawl out of there and be playing 2 weeks later. So for the next 3 weeks, expect it to be Dylan Gabriel as the starter. As I said, I don't, as bad as it. Let's say Dylan has an absolute nightmare game against the Steelers. I don't even think then they bench him. I think he will get a baseline of 6 games. Regardless of how bad it gets. And then if it is that bad, maybe they go to Shedeur for the final 6 or 5 games of the season. So that's how I would expect the next 3 weeks to be. As I said, Dylan as the starter, Shedeur as the backup, and then Bailey Zappi being elevated from the practice squad to be the emergency third quarterback on game day. But that's my thoughts on it. Overall, happy that the Joe Flacco 2.0 experiment is finally over. I didn't think it was going to work out. I clinged on to hope when they made the decision that he was the starter, but I'll be honest, wasn't the biggest fan of it. Would have preferred Kenny Pickett. Hell, Kenny Pickett's still out there. If they want to go and trade for him back, I'm obviously kidding. But happy that obviously Dylan continues to get his chance. Shedeur will get, he's closer to getting his chance now as the backup as well. At the end of the day, going into the season with the expectations we had, having 2 rookie quarterbacks, that's what most of us wanted in the end of the day, was to see what we had in those guys, and that's what we're going to get. So that's my thoughts on it, and that would do it for me today. As I said, wanted to make this fairly quick, but that would do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you do enjoy my content, then please drop this video a like, hit the subscribe button. It's free, but it really, really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. As I always say, I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and even if that means I only get to talk to 1 fan a day, I'm happy because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing rest of the week. But most importantly, go Browns.